Hey everyone, welcome to the channel. Today I have Arjun with me. Arjun is the co-founder of Connext, which is a layer 2 scaling platform that lets Ethereum projects enable lightning fast transaction for their users. And today we are going to talk to him more about his project and where is his project headed in the future. So hi Arjun, how are you?
Hey Arnav, how's it going?
So can you give a brief background and how did you actually get into the crypto space?
Yeah, sure. So I was a physics and philosophy double major. So kind of from physics, I was interested in like technical stuff. Ended up moving to San Francisco after graduating and became really interested in universal basic income, finding ways to reduce the need for people to be like bound to a salary in order to like survive. And one of the ways one of the things that is kind of a big promise of decentralized systems is being able to like lower the marginal cost of most activities and facilitate some sort of universal basic income in the future. So I ended up kind of learning about Ethereum in the winter of 2016, just kind of by chance. And then once I learned about it, like couldn't stop working on it. Basically became, I think a lot of other people have had this experience too, where once they started in the crypto space, they just weren't able to leave it. It just sucks you in.
Yeah, that is true. That is true. So how did you like start? Did you start with some small projects and then finally like get into Connext?
Yeah. So I started working on a developer API with a couple of people. And then also started at a hackathon, built out a crowdfunding platform called Village. What I found across the board was that like this was before things had really taken off, before like the ICO hype took over. It's kind of like early spring of 2017. What I found across the board was like people were building applications and doing really interesting stuff, but there were no users. My hypothesis was that was because it was just really difficult to buy and use tokens. The friction of having to acquire tokens was high enough that like none of these platforms were actually getting any traction with their friends. And I had that experience personally with the crowdfunding platform that we built. And so I started Connext originally with the idea of let's make it very easy for people to get tokens, ideally using a credit card, and then use them seamlessly in application without needing to have something like MetaMask. Of course, we've kind of changed what we do since then, and largely that was because the market changed. So suddenly there was like this ICO bull rush. A lot of people started raising money, and then everybody ended up kind of getting focused around that and the regulations around that, rather than like building and bringing a product to market. So what we found was that there weren't actually that many use cases for what we were building.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so and then you started with Connext. How was that? Like, why did you start with Connext, and why did you like start with building this framework for state channels? Yeah.
So that was Connext originally, was the cards thing.
Mm-hmm.
And we did that from May of 2017 until January of this year. We were kind of fully focused on credit cards and card payments for tokens.
Yeah.
We ended up moving over to state channels because after talking to companies in the space, we found that the biggest problem wasn't even like getting users on board. It was scaling to be able to have users. And across the board, like almost all the companies that we talked to said that they either had or were going to have some problem associated with scaling very soon. And so we ended up kind of becoming interested in state channels because we saw, okay, well, for one specific company that we were talking to, we were like, okay, well, what sorts of problems do you have? And they were talking about how they were having issues paying tokens between users. And scaling that. And so we were like, well, what about something like state channels? What about something like payment channels? And across the board, when we started asking those questions, we realized that one, there's no sort of standardized mechanism for making state channels. In fact, even payment channels, which are relatively really basic. And there's really no, best practices. There's no easy way to do that. Most people are having to build like custom implementations that take a long period of time and end up being like a core part of your business model. Funfair is an example, SpankChain is another example, Althea is another example. And like taking all of the time to build a custom implementation ends up not being worthwhile for most companies. So when we originally started, it was just like, hey, let's make state channels easy enough for people to use, so then that way we could solve this problem for them and then go back to doing the cards thing. And we've realized since then that like state channels are hugely important, probably more important than card payments will ever be.
Awesome. So can you explain like what exactly is Connext trying to do in brief?
Yeah. So no matter what, like, the way that you can think about state channels is like, it's kind of like a series of separate layers, right? Like you bundle it all into this like layer 2 scaling solution, but really it's like there is the contract layer, which includes what is basically a multi-sig, and then like some sort of like dispute resolution or state management logic. And then you have like a communication layer, which is for like generating and then passing and then verifying signed messages between users. And then you have like the like application layer where you need you need to be able to like automatically sign transactions. You need to be able to handle like messages in a way that like scales to like batch signing messages and like queuing systems and things like that. What a lot of people don't realize is like most, like 95 to somewhere between like 95 and 99% of the research right now is going into that bottom like smart contract layer. And this is what like projects like Counterfactual and things like that are doing, is focusing on like what is the most efficient mechanism for building state channels on chain, and then handling all of the off chain stuff later. And I think that's really, really valuable. And I think that's definitely research that's incredibly worth doing. But I think also from a practical standpoint, for most companies, there's also a lot of like the vast majority of work really needs to happen off chain for them, because this is an off chain scaling solution. And so what we do is we actually, rather than focusing on like building the best on chain framework possible, we're trying to be framework agnostic and then build the infrastructure that you need to do the off chain bits, like creating and signing transactions, scaling for like enterprise use and things like that.
So what do you mean that you are framework agnostic, that you can use like Ethereum and other blockchains as well?
No, I mean like if so like there's different types of state channel frameworks, right? There's counterfactual instantiation framework. SpankChain has their generalized state channels that are also counterfactual instantiation based. And then one of the companies that one of the research entities that works with SpankChain and us, called Finality Labs, is working on like a different construction of that with us. And then there's like Perun, which is like virtual channels, which is like you have normal channels and you build channels on top of them in order to like do more things on top of some basic level layer. And then you have like traditional hash locks, like Raiden and Lightning. These are all different sorts of constructions for how you can do state channels. And they all have their like advantages and drawbacks. What we expect is that some constructions are going to be better for some things than others. And like each construction is going to unlock a bunch of use cases that people can like build things with. But the infrastructure layer that like happens off chain can probably be relatively agnostic to whichever one of those you use.
Okay, I get it. So like what can actually Connext be used for currently? Which projects are using it?
So the first hub that we've kind of set up, which will be live in a week on mainnet, is SpankChain. SpankChain is basically doing like streaming payments. So this would be a hub for like streaming payments, content micropayments, and things like that. So that's one of the use cases that's available right now. Other things that you can set up hubs for in the immediate future, for like we've just done the absolute basic implementation of the state channels underneath, but the other things that you can use hubs for right now are peer-to-peer marketplaces, really, really useful for that. Decentralized exchange, subscription model companies, IoT microtransactions, so like machine-to-machine payments. We're working with we're working, well, not on the infrastructure side, but more on the like core contract side. We've worked with Althea, which is a mesh network. So those would be the sorts of things that are valuable right now. Basically, like high frequency transactions that are happening between like any two participants within an ecosystem. One of the big advantages to like one of the big things that we're doing, which is different from how most other state channel projects have existed, is this concept of hubs. So traditionally with a state channel, you have to open a new channel with everybody that you're transacting with, which means that you have to transact with each person, upwards of 15 to 20 times, depending on your channel construction. That's obviously not really going to happen much. Like the number of cases where that happens is very low. So with state channel hubs, everybody opens a channel with the hub, and then you can transact with anybody else that is in that ecosystem because you're transacting through the hub. And so that means that you don't really have to, like the burden for opening new channels and paying gas and like the friction associated with doing that is pretty much completely gone.
So state channels are like a more generalized form of like payment channels, and payment channels you can only do payments. But most of the use cases that you are mentioning currently are related to payments. Like how is that going to evolve to say multiplayer games, like for like say playing chess on the blockchain or something like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So basically what you can do in a state channel is associated with what your contract framework does, right? Like, because ultimately you could do anything in a state channel. You just need to make sure that it's still trustless. And it's still trustless if you have some logic in your contract code that lets you basically understand the win condition or the payout condition for like a game or for whatever it is, whatever activity it is that you're doing. The reason that we've kind of done payments like in like payment related cases so far is that I think upgrading that framework is something that a lot of other companies are researching and that they're working on, and that's not really a core part of what we're doing. But we have like a relatively good understanding of how payments work now, and payment channels work, and so building like the off-chain infrastructure based around like payments for now was a good way to get started with like actually getting to market and like building something that really serves use cases that are meaningful. So it's important to note that like our core innovation isn't going to be on like state channel research, even though that's something that we're really interested in helping with and contributing to and funding. Our core innovation is like the hubs and hub related networking infrastructure.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. And so how, like, do you see that we'll have like games on the blockchain coming up that are going to use channels, or is it that they'll maybe use something like a side chain, and for payment they are going to use like for payment channels? So how is that going to evolve?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it depends on the game. Like state channels are really, really good for two-person interactions. Basically, like arguably, like there's some debate about this, but the way that a lot of people define state channels is that it's some sort of off-chain mechanism where you need unanimous consent from everybody in order to move forward. And that's why state channels have like all of these advantages, like transaction finality or the ability to exit the channel really quickly. Is because like every single transaction that you do has the ability to get unanimous consent from everybody. Now, unanimous consent is really easy to do when there's two people. It's a lot harder to do when there's more than two people. And when there's more than two people, usually you can get away with doing something like majority wins. And so like the kind of big difference between state channels and side chains / plasma is I think state channels are better for two-person interactions, and then side chains plasma are better for 3+ person interactions, which need a consensus mechanism.
Okay. So how, like, do you see any games or any applications other than payments coming up for state channels in the near future?
Yeah. So things so there's a lot that you can do with payments that is also just not a traditional payment channel, right? Like payment logic is something that a lot of people undervalue. Like a subscription model, for instance. Like being able to just put money into a contract and have that subscription model pay itself out rather than you continually sign messages is pretty valuable. There's other things too, like decentralized exchange is something that you can run in a state channel that kind of looks like payments, but it's kind of not. And you need doing that like while keeping track of state is probably more efficient than running two payment channels going in opposite directions. I think games are probably the next easiest bet after that, because games are a good example of a situation where like there's something on the line, like you want to win for some reason. Mm-hmm. And I think what you'll see is that ultimately the things that people will use payment channels for will always be something where there's something at stake. Like where like there's a reason for it to be trustless, because you don't want the other person to cheat, because there's some reputation involved or some value involved or something involved that like matters to the participants. Yeah.
Okay. And like, do you see that? Can you like give an example of say a decentralized exchange running on like a state channel and explaining like the whole architecture of that and how maybe where does Connext fit into that picture?
Yeah. So decentralized exchanges work right now as is, but they can't do certain activities like high frequency trading. We've talked to a couple of the exchanges, and basically like exchanges are usually optimized for certain sorts of activities. So you have like very slow, like large order exchanges, which are really just like OTC trading desks, right? Like where you're buying, hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of Ether or something like that. And those are very slow, very infrequent, but have to be very secure. And you always kind of want to do that on chain. And then there's like the middle tier, which is like where 0x is right now, where people are trading like once a week or so, maybe a few times a week. And then you have high frequency trading, where people are trading many, many times a day, but they're usually just trading between two assets. You could do high frequency trading on a decentralized exchange, which has typically not been possible in the past, by mimicking what centralized exchanges do. So what centralized exchanges do is they use like a settlement layer. In this case, it would be Ethereum. And then they have like a centralized clearance layer. So when you stake your funds into, or not stake, but when you send your funds into Coinbase custodies your assets. And then when you trade on like GDAX or Coinbase's platform, Coinbase just clears your transactions. They basically just make like database updates instead of actually moving money around. And you trust them to do that accurately. And then when you exit, they figure out, they like retrieve your balance from the database, and then like you leave with your balance. With state channels, what you can do is you can build a clearance layer that is decentralized and trustless. And that's, I think, really powerful. So what Connext would be on top of a decentralized exchange is like you could have some sort of settlement layer where people are transacting assets to each other, and then have a clearance layer on top of that where it's like people stake their assets in their wallet or something like that, like in their own wallet and lock them for the purposes of trading. And then you just send signed messages back and forth like a state channel. And that kind of is where the high frequency trading happens. And then down the line, like at the end of the day or something like that, when you want to settle, you call like settle channel or something like that. And that unlocks your assets and updates your balances.
Okay.
That makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. And one last point I want to discuss is like we have like Bitcoin community working on Lightning, and we have Ethereum community working on state channels. So how are their developments panning out? Like Lightning, we have like they have built a great developer community as well, like the Lightning Labs implementation. And how are like the developments different, and where are they headed?
Yeah, that's a good question. So Lightning is really, really awesome. I think they're doing like incredibly phenomenal work. But one thing that I notice, and like I do think that state channels are more generalizable. I think in the long run, it probably makes more sense to go towards state channels rather than like just payment channels, and like have a state channel framework that also does payments. and I think that Ethereum state channel, like even if you build just payment channels on Ethereum, there is value to that as well, because you can use stable coins for that, which you can't do on Bitcoin. But I think Lightning is doing, like, I think Bitcoin and the Lightning community is doing a lot better right now. And the reason is that they're collaborating. Like what you notice in the Ethereum community is that there's a ton of payment and state channel projects. And most of them are working kind of like in their isolated groups. And there's a reason for that. Like no one really knows how to monetize state channels. And so like until they know how to monetize state channels, like I think people are trying to just capture like social capital and like thought leadership and like take over like the intellectual mind share for like their way of doing things. But I think that ends up being counterproductive, because then you have instances of organizations that are all working like closed source or in silos, and then they're not really sharing what they're doing, and that slows everybody down. So I think that's something that needs to change. Like I think there needs to be a lot more collaboration between state channels projects on Ethereum, because fundamentally I don't think that this is like I think I think state channels in general are huge, like a huge space, and I don't think that any one company is going to do everything right. And so that's kind of the big difference that I would say people should pay attention to.
And like, what about the technical developments? Like Lightning's implementation, does it have a lot of features that like it has like moved the technology very fast, and in compared to the implementation, say, done by SpankChain or other companies that have worked on payment channels?
Yeah. So what's really interesting about Lightning is I guess they're in a sense they're kind of like us, where they're more focused on the infrastructure bits than the actual like optimizing channel contracts. So Lightning just uses like atomic channels that are very basic and like relatively basic, and use like hashed time locks, right? And those have been around for a very long time and are very well researched. And the reason that they're doing that is they're saying, okay, let's focus more on the network aspect of it than the actual optimizing on the contract aspect of it, which is kind of what we're planning to do as well. And in that sense, I think they have made a phenomenal amount of progress. Like I'm honestly astounded by how amazingly well Lightning has come together, considering that it's a decentralized project. Two, like really realistically, it hasn't actually been worked on for that long. And three, they were doing something that just wasn't like, they're solving hard computational problems that just no one had even considered before. Like routing and things like that. The fact that like there are some problems with Lightning right now associated with like probabilistic transactions. So like depending on how many nodes your transaction is routed over, it may or may not get there. And like there's a pretty strong drop off of the likelihood of whether your payment will get there based on how far it's going. But the fact that it is even routing effectively is just a huge step in the right direction. And that's a problem that we're going to have to solve eventually, and we're probably going to end up using a lot of the insights that are gained from projects like Lightning in order to figure out how to do that.
Yeah. And what is like usually the business model that you see that people who are working on, say, generalized state channels, something like that, say people are working on Connext or L4 or even Lightning, what sort of business model that can they have?
That's a good question. So a lot of people, this doesn't include Lightning, but a lot of companies have tried to engineer a token into their state channel framework. I don't know, like it may be possible to use a token to borrow collateral, or like use a token to provide like ancillary value associated with the network, but I don't think you can monetize the core network. And I think the reason for this is that a payment or state channel network, by its very own nature, has to be open and free and permissionless. And I think that's a big part of what makes it valuable. Because otherwise you end up just recreating something like Visa, MasterCard, which would just be like absolutely the wrong direction for this industry to head. The way that we're planning on monetizing is to not even like focus on, like, we want to help build this open source network. But I think like our methodology has always been, okay, let's work as an open source like infrastructure project, and then let's also build a centralized company. And so the way that we are planning to monetize is to just build good user experience on top of the open source network. And I think people will pay for good UX. Like GitHub, for instance, people pay for GitHub even though the Git protocol is free. And I think this is especially true of like larger companies that will want to integrate like their own hubs, but won't want to do that in a way that's really high friction. They won't want to have to build out a ton of custom code in order to manage that integration. So that's kind of the goal, is to like target around not just being open source state channel network, but also be a Stripe for setting up state channel hubs.
Mm-hmm. And like in the initial days, like this is more of a case when say the platform got success, but say in the initial years, usually how are the companies managing funds? It's just like grants, or like are they receiving funding? How does that happen?
Yeah, that's a good question. So some companies have raised funds, like Raiden raised funds, Seller I think raised funds, Spankchain raised funds, but obviously their core business is something else. A lot of it's basically broken up into like implementation organizations and then research organizations, right? So all the research organizations like Counterfactual, Magmo, Funfair, not Funfair, sorry, Finality, like all of those have gotten grants. And that makes sense, like because they're trying to do like research into the best practices for building this stuff. I think all of the implementation companies are either are finding a way to monetize, or already have a way to monetize that is just not part of like core state channels like Spankchain. And then I think we would kind of fall into that latter core category where we're like integration for state channels rather than like just the core product itself.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And just like for the final thoughts, do you want to share like how can people get involved? How can developers start building? I think you launched a get started as well that people can get.
So earlier today, I guess yesterday, I don't know. Earlier today in Pacific time, we launched our pilot program, and basically we're very, very close to going live with Spankchain. We'll probably do that within the next week or so. And once we do that, we kind of want to move quickly and find other companies who have this problem and collect feedback from them. So what we're looking for is 4 to 5 companies that really have this burning problem, ideally have users and who need to set up a state channel hub as soon as possible. We're looking to work with them to collect feedback to make sure that our business model makes sense, and eventually, they would be the group of first 5 to 6 companies who we would go live with in a few months once we went into open beta.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah. And do you want to say if someone wants to build a single developer and they want to build a state channel, so do you have plans for reaching out to them as well?
Yeah. So what we're trying to do is also open source as much of the general infrastructure as we can. And so especially the underlying contracts and things like that, and not just open source it, but turn it into easy to use packages, so people can get started integrating it themselves. So that's something that I guess people should expect within the next couple of months as well.
Awesome. Okay.
For now, you can always just check out our repositories and copy some of the code that's there, and then follow our website, which is HTTPS, or I guess it's just HTTP right now, but Connext.network, and then our Medium, which is medium.com/Connext.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks a lot, Arjun, for taking the time out. I really like your project and the way you're pushing the updates, and I wish you best of luck in the future.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much, Arna. Thanks for having me.